Today, as we witness the landing of President Trump in London, let's talk to Mr. William Spring, who is a member of the GOP, the Republicans overseas. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, pleased to talk to you again.
Mr. Spring, will you tell us what are your impressions so far about the President's visit, especially that he just came from a NATO meeting in Brussels?
Well, of course, there's an attempt by the orthodox or the official media here in this country to present him in a stereotyped way. I don't think it will succeed. It will succeed among the snowflake generation, if you like, the younger people who are easily influenced. But the majority of the people in this country are very pleased with the arrival of President Trump. They respect his office, which the BBC and Channel 4, I'm afraid, don't. I think they want the president to be treated with respect. You cannot behave in this ridiculous manner towards heads of state.
Yes.
I mean, this is crazy.
Speaking of media, Mr. Spring, what do you think of the coverage so far? We've seen the president upon the beginning of his dinner with the Prime Minister, and the way they were talking about the president, describing him as a very difficult person to deal with, wondering whether the Queen will cope, and the others saying, no, she's been through it before, portraying him as a persona who is completely sort of almost uncivilized.
Well, as you say, that is the stereotype that they official media want to present of President Trump. Mm-hmm. Now, the facts are, it would have been nicer from the point of view of tea parties and general lunches and so on, if we'd had that Democrat man as president. What was it? I'm not talking about the one who's actually stood, but the one who stood before. Mm-hmm. His name is eluding me at the minute.
Yes,
but
and
he was a Vietnam protester, mm-hmm. but he seemed a very civilized man.
Yes,
and it would have been far better from the point of view of the Americans and so on, in some respects, to have a more presentable, urbane image.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of the attack on the former ambassador to the US, Christopher Mayer, yesterday in London, near Victoria?
Well, I think from what I've read about it, it just seems to be general delinquency. Mm-hmm. I don't think there was necessarily a political motive. Yes. They've arrested 2 young people. And you've got to realise, Carl, that London is now as lawless as any part of the world, and much more lawless possibly than New York, because of the mayor, Khan.
Yes, but Mr. Khan suggests that the police force, the funding has been cut, and he's left with very low numbers and little funding, where this is really has affected the situation. However, some others argued that he knew exactly that this is the kind of budget that he's walking into, and he didn't really address it in the first place.
No, well, it's not budgetary. The issue is not budgetary. The issue is that the young people of this country are brainwashed and conditioned in a very dysfunctional educational system that ends up with many of them just being delinquents, because things like corporal punishment, or which was a factor at my school when I was a kid, are not allowed anymore. Mm-hmm. You can bring down a teacher by an allegation, so there's no respect. And Khan, the mayor, encourages this type of ridiculous attitude towards authority, mm-hmm. by silly business of this, allowing this ridiculous balloon to go up. I mean, that is ridiculous. But yes. you've got a problem with the society as a whole. We are dependent in this country, or have been dependent for many years, on a very limited media block. That is the BBC and Sky. And both of those organisations, the BBC worse than Sky, inculcate general delinquency in our children. And this is not a good thing. I think children should be brought up as we were in the 1950s, when I was around as a child in the school state educational system. We were brought up with a Christian act of worship every morning. We were brought up to believe that there were certain rights and wrongs, and Britain stood for things. This current dyslexic, multicultural society has no comprehension of these ideas.
Well, the former Prime Minister David Cameron has said that multiculturalism has admitted it has failed in Britain in the model that has been going for some years now. Speaking of the attitudes in the media and the culture, there seems to be a huge rift in society, not just in America and not just over President Trump, whether it was Brexit, whether it was other divisive subjects. There's a huge rift where people on the left accuse the people on the center that they're not taking any sides, for instance, or even if they're left-leaning, that they're not left-leaning enough, that they're not on the far left. Similarly, sometimes on the right, they wonder if you're, good to share a platform with because perhaps you're not too much on the right, or you could be in the middle or hesitant. What happened to people debating rationally, even if they don't share similar views?
Well, there is the concept of I don't agree with what you say, but I will defend your right to say it. It's disappeared. I'm afraid you're far more likely to find libertarians among the Tories than you will among the Labour Party, and certainly none among the Lib Dems. For my sins, I was once a Lib Dem and this was years ago, but I found them to be the most authoritarian, anti-liberal group I'd ever come in contact with. And they're now running in the same direction, only far worse than when I remember them. So we've got to really hope that at some stage there will be a resurgence of a belief in individual liberty and freedom to speak, which is not the situation at the moment. And I would also add, if you can just add this, freedom to pray, because the government of Mrs. May has outlawed prayer, Christian prayer, in many parts of Britain, particularly in Ealing, over a large part of the borough of Ealing. And
Labour borough, though, mostly.
Yes, I know. It was the Labour Party that actually outlawed prayer, but they were using flawed legislation put forward by the Conservatives. And Mrs. May is not a believer, although she poses as a Christian. In fact, she's not a Christian at all.
Well, her father is a vicar. He's a Catholic vicar.
Her father was a Church of England minister. Yes, but that means nothing, because the Church of England, unfortunately, particularly as currently constituted, led by Archbishop Welby, is just a complete flotsam and jetsam. Doctrine is changed every month or so when the General Synod has a meeting. And the General Synod is made up of people who nobody knows. I mean, I go to a Church of England church and I have not the slightest idea who the representative, if you can use that name, of the church where I go to is, who he is, who she is, or who it is.
Right. Where exactly, Mr. Spring, where exactly did they ban prayers in Ealing? Are you talking about churches?
No, this is outside. The Labour Party put forward a plan to stop all prayer around within quite a large area of Ealing near the Mary Stopes abortion clinic. So no one's allowed to pray, not even silently.
Well, here in New York, there were processions during Easter, during Good Friday, around the parishes, be they Catholic or Episcopal or any other denominations, and the police fully cooperated with these processions. I'm surprised to know that about Ealing, although in London, around Paddington, parishes do enjoy the freedom to do some processions when need be. This is quite some news. Let's speak a little bit about Brexit, Mr. Spring. The US president, was very clear upon his visit to the UK to show some sort of resentment about Brexit. He did clearly say Brexit is not what it was supposed to be or what it's thought to be. Is he referring here, do you reckon, about referring to the Chequers deal that the Prime
Yes,
Minister is
I
offering
think
for
he's.
now?
I think he's referring to the whole Theresa May direction of travel, which consummated at Chequers in this absolute terrible deal. I mean, this woman is supposedly a great manager of her party. Well, she's ended up entirely destroying her own premiership, in my
Is
opinion.
there a chance, while the president is in London, and especially with his proximity, so to speak, to resigned Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, is there some way to basically exploit that momentum to influence the Prime Minister to revert to a harder Brexit, a Brexit that respects the will of the people, especially who voted for Brexit?
Well, the trouble is she's lost anybody's respect here in UK.
What's the way out then?
The only way out is for her to resign. If she wants to have even a shred of respectability and credibility as a principled politician, she should resign now. There's plenty of good Conservatives willing to take over. Jacob Rees-Mogg is the obvious leader of the Conservative Party. This woman hasn't the slightest concern for the ordinary people of this country. She is quite happy to be directed by Mrs. Merkel, who came over to keep her on side 2 or 3 days ago at a meeting. Mrs. Merkel turned up in London. A very humiliating situation for Britain. A humiliating situation for the Conservative Party, that it should be led by a surrogate German Chancellor.
And yes, Mr. Spring, I know you're also passionate about another subject, which is liberties and freedom of speech in the UK, something that the UK cherishes. What do you think the US president should have, or maybe should still address the issue of Tommy Robinson, who was imprisoned recently in a very expedited manner for voicing his opinion in the UK? What do you think?
Absolutely, he should. I'm of the view that President Trump should request a visit to the particular torture chamber or prison or wherever he is being held. This may not happen, but the American ambassador in London, he is entitled to ask the British government for the rights of to visit Tommy Robinson, because many of us are very concerned that he's being tortured and certainly is under risk to his life. This is only because he's spoken to a mobile phone about 100 meters away from the court. Now that doesn't seem to me, or even any reasonable, sensible person, a criminal act. And for this, he's been locked away for 13 months. And furthermore, the particular twisted judge who made the decision has put a ban on reporting it, which was lifted only about 3 days after that. Notwithstanding having lifted the ban, the BBC and Sky still refused to report this case. Now, on Saturday, there is going to be a very large counter anti-Trump demonstration, if you like. There's going to be a very large demonstration for Tommy Robinson, which will be in London. I'm not quite sure where it begins, but I'm sure that it will be as large as the Owen Jones.
Yes. The US Embassy did warn about it, though, Mr. Spring. They warned their own citizens in the UK to keep a low profile in case of any security issues or maybe fifth columnists infiltrating the ranks of the people. One more thing, Mr. Spring. What happens? What do you think of some, obviously on the right or even on the center, depicting hypocrisy within the extreme left on human rights? They're accusing President Trump of locking kids illegally, separating them from their families, even though it was a policy that started at the times of Bill Clinton but never really implemented with zero tolerance until recently. And obviously the president has perhaps revisited his zero tolerance policy, as we well know. What do you think of these people? These people didn't even protest the Grenfell Fire Tower or even the Windrush situation where people from the Commonwealth, born British, came to the UK, lived here with no other home on earth. There was basically a gaffe under Amber Rudd, perhaps inherited from the previous office held by Theresa May as Home Secretary. We didn't really see mass protests on home soil in the UK. Why is it just fair game that they protest against Americans?
No, I agree. I think it was so appalling what happened over the Windrush saga and disgraceful. But Mrs. May, who was really responsible for it, didn't resign, which she should have done. And there was no mass protests organised by Owen Jones over this, although no doubt maybe he did organise. I may be a bit unfair to him there. But the facts are, the Windrush saga was the most disgraceful episode. But I'm used to disgraceful episodes with the British government. I've seen it all. I mean, I cannot see a single thread of principle in any of the British government's actions or policies for at least 30 years.
Is it fair, Mr. Spring, that an aging generation, the Windrush generation, get deported? They have nowhere to go back to, back in the Indies or where they come from, depends on their country, whether Jamaica or anything else. Is it fair that they get sent? Or obviously it was a failed attempt, but it hassled a lot of people, it devastated a lot of people. And then on the other hand, bring in and open the doors for people from Eastern Europe who do not speak the language, who do not share common culture. What do you think of all this?
Well, I think the biggest thing was Chagos Islands, where the Americans have now built a massive nuclear base, and from whence they bombed Iraq. These are islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And Harold Wilson, a Labour Prime Minister, years ago, leased them out to the Americans with the proviso that he would expel all the indigenous people of those islands. And they were just expelled, and no compensation has been to them. They were thrown out onto the refuse heap, and this was a disgrace for which I don't think Wilson's reputation will ever recover from.
Speak of Labour, Mr. Spring, one last question before we wrap up today. Sorry to interrupt. Do you think the Right Honourable Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the opposition, had he been Prime Minister, would have delivered a proposition better than the Chequers deal?
Yes, I do, as a matter of fact. Jeremy Corbyn is known and has been known for one of the few consistent things in his life has been his dislike of the European Union. He, in this sense, he was following Tony Benn, who was the main Labour spokesman against the European Union. Now, I do not believe for 1 minute that Jeremy Corbyn has changed his views. He has, furthermore, on all the really important votes, he's made sure that his vote, or the Labour Party vote, officially has gone against the Remainers. He's in favour of leaving the EU. He's radical, but he's sat upon by the fact there were a lot of Blairites in the Labour Party. The Blairites, remember, are the Gauleiters of the Labour Party who cheered on the bomb in Iraq.
Do you
And these
think,
people,
Mrs.
yeah,
Spring, do you think the fear amongst the Tory lines that Jeremy Corbyn will be Prime Minister should the Tory cabinet collapse, or there was a leadership contest, or indeed a snap general elections, do you think this fear from the Tories is exactly what's keeping Theresa May afloat? As long as Jeremy Corbyn is not Prime Minister, they're happy with Theresa May no matter what she does.
well, I think that's being seen through now. I think people just want May out, and they don't care who's going to replace her as long as it's not May, as long as May goes. It's like 1940, this is, when Chamberlain lost his majority or in the House of Commons and was replaced by Winston Churchill, who should have been the Prime Minister all the time. But Mrs. May is a completely discredited reptilian figure who really has betrayed the British people, and she should be got rid of.
That's obviously your opinion, which we do respect indeed. Thank you very much, Mr. Spring, for your contribution today. We do hope to get people from the other side of the spectrum, obviously, to talk to us as well and look into this. We will be following President Trump's visit in London closely as we go through. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. No.